You don't become a good communist by going to meetings or memorizing the manifesto. You do it on the streets. You do it with your fists. The rest is bullshit, and you know it.
Gregor, relax. This is not helping the situation. You know, whenever I get frustrated, I just think, what would Lenin do? Gregor, what would Lenin do?
What would Lenin do? What would Lenin do? What would Lenin do? Okay, what would Lenin do? What would Lenin do? Lenin would fuck him up!
Hello. Welcome in, everyone. We are the Red Army. I'm Sal.
I'm Reggie.
And Kooks is muted.
And Kooks is muted. Kooks, you're muted, dude.
And I am
There you go.
Kooks. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's been a minute, all right?
Yeah.
I'm back to Boomer. All right. Okay. Uh, by the way, that's my first time seeing that intro, and it's fire. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you.
So, round of
So
applause for
pretty.
Sal for amazing editing skills, to be honest.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, of course. All right. So I
So
guess we'll just jump right
question
into
for
it.
you.
Yeah.
How many chairs do you make, Kooks?
How many chairs do I make? Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I see that. It depends on how productive my labor is from day to day. Yeah, So I don't really have a concrete answer. It's kind of based on need. All right. So I guess we'll jump right into it. So today, I'm going to be giving a short presentation, or try to keep it short, on a very essential text, in my opinion. It's a really important text. It's on Contradiction from Chairman Mao. Now, this text really kind of expands upon a lot of past written down concepts of dialectics and contradictions, and it gives us a sort of concrete way of analyzing them, not only as the general form of contradictions, but it gives them a character, and it allows us to go in even more depth in how we analyze, aspects of contradictions, what they look like, antagonistic, non-antagonistic. We'll get into that. So, I am just going to go ahead and begin. And the way Mao starts this, the main point of all this that you're going to notice is that we are talking about this idea of the unity of opposites, to where the world kind of operates out of opposites, where things exist because they are in contradiction with other things. And so Mao opens up by talking about how there's two world outlooks that are kind of competing with each other ideologically. And the first one is what was held for a really long time, which is the metaphysical, the vulgar materialist, mechanical outlook. And this outlook basically says that everything is isolated and static, one-sided, and not in interaction with other things. So the metaphysical aspect. And so this belief holds that everything, since it came into being, is how it is. It hasn't changed. It's not in transition from one state to another. It is eternally how it is. This idea, Mao says, developed in Europe, and it dominated the 17th and 18th century ideologies. And he says how in China, the feudal landlord class used this outlook, this idea of the unchanging Tao, to justify their rule. And this is how they pushed back on revolutionism. They said, well, this is how it is. Things can't change because this is how it's always been. And this is a very vulgar way of analyzing history. And so then we have the other outlook, which is the Marxist dialectical outlook. And this view basically says that we have to view a thing internally and in relation to other things. So he states that through this outlook, we understand things that the cause of a change in an object is primarily internal. So the contradictoriness within the thing is the main force of change, while its relation to the things outside of it, the other things, is a secondary force. And again, in contrast to the metaphysical view, this outlook says that things are not in isolation nor static. And we see examples of this a lot in daily life as well. So I want to briefly talk about the external versus the internal causes, which he touches upon. Essentially, change is not only caused by internal factors. So basically, external causes, they kind of act as conditions for a change to occur. But internal causes are the basis on which this change occurs. So basically, external causes can only change a thing if its internal contradictions are already developed enough to allow for the external cause to change the thing. So, as Mao would have said it, quote, external changes become operative through internal causes. So both matter, but the difference is now we're observing the internal motives of everything. And so he uses a really good example, which is the egg example. So the external, let's take an external environment. the atmosphere, the simple atmosphere. If we take an egg and we put it in the atmosphere, it's going to develop into a chicken. And essentially why that happens is because of the internal contradictions of the egg. It allows for the external force or the external cause to necessitate life. Now, Mal says, let's take a rock. Put a rock out there. A rock, we know intuitively that a rock can't just develop into a chicken. And the reason for this is because its internal contradictions are vastly different from the internal contradictions of an egg. And so nothing's going to happen to it. Or it's not going to turn into a chicken. Nothing will happen to it, obviously. But it won't happen in the same way as the egg. So
Yes. Also,
then,
I just want to say, also with the
Go ahead.
external contradictions, also need to be applied to the egg. Like, for example, the right energy needs to be applied to the egg, because otherwise, the internal contradictions would mean absolutely nothing. Yes, sir. On the inside, it can develop into an egg, but if the external does not act upon it, it's still just going to be an egg.
right. If you
So they
put
have
them
to
in a
work in
vacuum,
conjunction.
nothing happens.
Yeah.
Yes. They are they both hold very important roles in all of this. It's just the difference is we now start observing things internally as well in the dialectical outlook. This is the juxtaposition to the sort of previously held beliefs. So now Mao takes this argument and he applies it to social life and revolution. So he references how the October Revolution in Russia, it opened the door for other revolutions to take place. So the revolution itself was an external cause. And in the case of China, Mao writes that they already had the internal contradictions were developed enough to where this external force of the revolution not far away would allow it to occur. And so it was kind of the force that allowed for this change to happen. And something that Mao also talks about here is that contradictions, they don't only arise in the masses and in social life in general, but they are very prevalent within party organization and in the party as a whole. So when you organize, because this process of organizing is so extensive and convoluted, contradictions are bound to arise. And the contradictions here are, primarily they begin ideologically. So it's mostly like the ideas don't match. So Mao also writes how the liquidation of these contradictions through various methods we're going to talk about later allowed for the movement to progress. It stagnates. It'll tend to stagnate if these contradictions are not dealt with, and you see other problems, and these I'll mention later. So now we get to this section on universality of contradictions. So essentially, Mao writes that dialectical materialism doesn't just allow for a theoretical mapping of social forces, but to the natural sciences as well. So he's going to use a bunch of examples here. And he qualifies what he means by universality of contradictions. So he gives two separate meanings. The first one is that contradictions exist in the process of development of all things. Old contradictions die out, new ones appear as things develop. And in the process of development of everything, a movement of opposites exists from beginning to end. So in every stage, when you develop a new contradiction or a new idea, you develop its opposite as well from the quote-unquote opposite end, we might say. So a good example is the contradiction of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. They can't coexist, right? They are contradicting each other. But they require each other to exist, to actually have meaning. So there's a universal sense of contradiction here. And within contradictions, this exists at the beginning of the contradiction occurring. So what Mao is saying is that the bourgeoisie didn't develop and then later the proletariat developed. No, they developed simultaneously. So it wasn't like one appeared and the other one followed later. When one appears, it necessitates at the exact moment the appearance of the other. Otherwise, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, the bourgeoisie wouldn't have existed if the proletariat didn't exist, and the proletariat wouldn't have existed without the bourgeoisie. There is no oppressor without oppressed, and there's no oppressed without the oppressor.
Yeah, exactly. This is kind of the unity of opposites, where they exist separate from each other, but they also have to exist with each other to actually have meaning. So here Mao cites Lenin. So Lenin writes about contradictions in sciences. So this applies to a whole plethora of sort of non-social science fields. So in mathematics, we have positive and negative. Well, what is positive if it's not contrasted by negative, right? And you have a differential and integral. Well, if you take a derivative of something, it doesn't matter unless you're also able to integrate it and go in the reverse. In mechanics, you have action and reaction. In physics, you have positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the combination and dissolution of atoms. So everything has sort of an opposite end to it. And if it doesn't have that opposite end, the one aspect can't make sense. Because what is it, right? I mean, again, we know positive is positive because negative exists. And so this example, in the social sciences, we have class struggle and war, offense and defense, advance and retreat, and victory and defeat. So these are these contradictions applied to the study of social sciences. And contradiction also plays a heavy role in ideology. So every difference in man's concept should be seen as objective contradictions. And so objective contradictions are reflected in projective thinking. So how we think is played out by contradictions as well. It's sort of our own internal processing of what we understand things to be versus a different outlook that's presented to us, for example. So, and then Mao writes that when a new process emerges, it's already constituted on the basis of contradictions. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. When Mao writes that when something appears, its opposite appears as well. When something is developed, it immediately forms a basis of contradiction. Otherwise, it can't exist. Right. So, good example is capitalism immediately, by its very nature, had this contradiction of proletariat and bourgeoisie, of socialized labor and individual appropriation. So,
Cahal is here. Oh,
yo, really?
Yeah.
Oh, let's go. Anyways, so the birth of capitalism also was the birth of these inherent contradictions. So then, move on. Mao talks about the particularity of contradiction. So essentially, every single thing, contains within it its own particular contradictions. And this constitutes, its individual essence, and it distinguishes it from other things. This is how we see things separately. So everything is interdependent and interconnected, but each thing on its own is also distinct from one thing because of this difference in particular contradiction. So this also applies to the sciences. Every form of science, ideology, society, struggle, they all have their own distinct contradictions, and this gives them their own particular character. So, good example, I referenced the sciences that are listed from Lenin above. So math has separate particular contradictions from physics, right? And that's different from literature. These all have different contradictions, and that's what makes them unique. And each science is unique and it's differentiated from the other because of its particular contradictions. And so, in the case of the social science, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as well as socialized labor forms and individual appropriation, these are fundamental to the structure of capitalism. And this is how we understand capitalism to be separate from the previous modes of production: feudalism, slave society, communal, primitive communism, right? Mm-hmm. Moving on, we now have how we understand both universality and particularity of contradictions. So we need to understand both to also understand each on their own. So in the sense that they're in a dialectical relationship. So I'm going to quote Mao here directly from the text. He says, "Unless we understand the universality of contradiction, we have no way of discovering the universal cause or universal basis for the movement or development of individual things. And unless we study the particularity of contradiction, we have no way of determining the particular essence of a thing which differentiates it from other things, no way of discovering the particular cause or particular basis for the movement or development of a thing, and no way of distinguishing one thing from another, or of demarcating fields of science." So, here we're talking about a sequence of knowledge. So, basically, this sequence, it starts with understanding particular things, and then it moves to understanding things in the general. So, but only after understanding things in the individual can we start to develop this understanding of the general from the individual. And so this is known as inductive reasoning, so the specific to the general. So after we understand the general, we actually go back to the particular. But this time we have a further developed understanding, and it allows us to study things more deeply as we understand the general now. So this is kind of intuitive. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's quite simple to understand, and I'm going to give you a very easy example of evolution. Darwin starts with individual observation, studies animals, specific animals, in this case the finches. He studies the beaks of different finches on the Galapagos Islands. And what he understands from this is eventually, after he discovers these differences, he moves to a general claim that the environment is changing development of different finches depending on where they are. And so this becomes a general law, and this is what we know as natural selection. Now, he has now produced this theory of natural selection. We can go back to studying individual animals, but now we study them through this lens of evolutionary development. And so this is the process of understanding the particular to the universal, or the general back to the particular. So, and of course, this method of knowledge is how we also study society, and this is how Marx and Engels came to understand capitalism. And they were alive as we are in a very volatile time. So it's no coincidence that these theories arose in the time that they did. So they began observing the study of the crises and the symptoms of class society, as we see them every day as well. And after seeing these crises, they formulated a general theory of historical materialism, obviously among other observations, but to simplify things. And then so after developing this, they now return to the particular study of capitalism. And now they view it through the lens of class and class interests, and how social institutions are interrelated, who they further the interests of, and how that relates to the class struggle. So I'm going to quote Mao again. He says, "Thus, cognition always moves in cycles, and so long as the scientific method is strictly adhered to, each cycle advances human knowledge a step higher and makes it more and more profound." All right, so now I'm going to move on to the particular contradictions in processes. Just got to pull up some quotes here. All right, so Mao says that each process of development, as we know, is qualitatively different, and it requires different methods to solve it. So I'm going to read a quote here from Mao. He says, "Qualitatively different contradictions can only be resolved by qualitatively different methods. For instance, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is resolved by the method of socialist revolution. The contradiction between the great masses of the people and the feudal system is resolved by the method of democratic revolution. The contradiction between the colonies and imperialism is resolved by the method of national revolutionary war. The contradiction between the working class and the peasant class in socialist society is resolved by the method of collectivization and mechanization in agriculture. Contradiction with the Communist Party is resolved by the method of criticism and self-criticism. The contradiction between society and nature is resolved by the method of developing the productive forces. Processes change. Old processes and old contradictions disappear. New processes and new contradictions emerge. And the methods of resolving contradictions differ accordingly. In Russia, there was a fundamental difference between the contradiction resolved by the February Revolution and the contradiction resolved by the October Revolution, as well as the methods used to resolve them. The principle of using different methods to resolve different contradictions is one which Marxist-Leninists must strictly observe. The dogmatists do not observe this principle. They do not understand that conditions differ in different kinds of revolution, and so do not understand that different methods should be used to resolve different contradictions. On the contrary, they invariably adopt what they imagine to be an unalterable formula and arbitrarily apply it everywhere, which only causes setbacks to the revolution or makes a sorry mess of what was originally well done. To sum that up, we need different methods. So to understand particular contradictions within a process, moving on here, we also have to understand each aspect of each contradiction. And so to best know how to resolve a contradiction, we have to understand both sides to their fullest. Or as Mao would put it, we have to avoid one-sidedness. So I'm going to briefly read this quote. To be one-sided means not to look at problems all-sidedly. For example, to understand only China but not Japan, only the Communist Party but not the Kuomintang, only the proletariat but not the bourgeoisie, only the peasants but not the landlords, only the favorable conditions but not the difficult ones, only the past but not the future, only individual parts but not the whole, only the defects but not the achievements, only the plaintiff's case but not the defendant's, only underground revolutionary work but not open revolutionary work, and so on. In a word, it means not to understand the characteristics of both aspects of contradiction. So, put it simply, we have to observe all sides of things. In the case of a contradiction, both sides. So we have to, and this is going to help us best determine how to resolve a contradiction. So not only must we study the particular contradictions in a thing or process, but we also have to now observe the particular contradictions in each stage of a process, because as we understand it, things are in transition from one state to another. And in each stage of this transition, there is also a contradiction. So brief quote here is, the reason that, although the nature of the fundamental contradiction in the process of development and the essence of the process remain unchanged, the fundamental contradiction becomes more and more intensified as it passes from one stage to another in the lengthy process. So we have new contradictions and existing ones becoming more exacerbated. So we have to study the contradictions at each stage of a process. And so when we study particular contradictions, we have to study the contradiction of each thing and study the contradiction of each thing's development. And so the contradiction at each stage in the process of development of each thing, basically. This is important because this is how we better understand where we are at this point in history, for example. How do we resolve where we're at right now? Okay. We'll close off on that for now. And now we're going to go to this idea of the principal contradiction. So there are two aspects of a particular contradiction. There is the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. So let's quickly go over that. So the principal contradiction is basically what it means. It's the primary contradiction of a thing. So all things have more than one contradiction. There are many contradictions in all things that exist. But there's always a main contradiction that holds the greatest effect and in turn impacts the secondary contradictions. So the obvious example for us would be capitalism, whose primary contradiction is the proletariat and bourgeoisie, while secondary contradictions could be petty bourgeoisie versus the big bourgeoisie, for example. But the main one that exists is this revolutionary class, the proletariat, against the bourgeoisie. So not grasping the principal contradiction is going to hinder and not allow us to resolve the secondary contradictions. Because we're going to give them equal weight, which is incorrect. So Mao here actually clarifies his earlier point where he insisted on understanding all the contradictions of a thing. This is true, but we can't give them each the same amount of weight because they don't carry the same amount of weight. And so now moving on to the principal aspect of a contradiction. So an aspect in this case is one of the two sides of a contradiction. And in this case, it's the same thing. The principal aspect is essentially the one that holds the most weight or is currently overpowering the other incongruently. So one aspect in a contradiction is the principal, the other one is the secondary. And everything is typically defined primarily by the principal contradictions and the aspect. So in capitalism, as it stands, in capitalism, the bourgeoisie is the dominant aspect over the proletariat. So naturally, the two classes, they can't be equal because this challenges the very nature of contradictions. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist, as we had mentioned earlier. So this other idea is that there is always contradiction between the new and the old in everything. So I'm going to quote Mao again here. He says, "We often speak of the new superseding the old. The suppression of the old by the new is a general, eternal, and inviolable law of the universe. The transformation of one thing into another through leaps of different forms in accordance with its essence and external conditions. This is the process of the new superseding the old. In each thing, there is contradiction between its new and its old aspects, and this gives rise to a series of struggles with many twists and turns. As a result of these struggles, the new aspects change from being minor to being major and rises to predominance, while the old aspect changes from being major to being minor and gradually dies out. And the moment the new aspect gains dominance over the old thing changes qualitatively into a new thing. It can thus be seen that the nature of a thing is mainly determined by the principal aspect of the contradiction, the aspect which has gained predominance. When the principal aspect which has gained predominance changes, the nature of a thing changes accordingly. So basically, the contradiction between the new and the old ensures that nothing stays static. There's always this battle between what is struggling to be born. In the case of capitalism, this socialist movement, it's struggling to be born, to bring into existence this newer world. And of course, the old mechanisms prevent that from happening because it directly challenges their existence. So this is the contradiction we are facing now in this sense of new versus the old. So, when the principal aspect of the principal contradiction, the minute it's overtaken by its opposite, this is when we see a qualitative change. And so, in the case of Marxism, we have the minute we establish dictatorship of the proletariat, we have reversed the roles of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. Where the bourgeoisie had ruled earlier, we now have the proletariat ruling. And this is where we see that qualitative change of a switch to a socialist mode of production.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's a brief quote I want to touch upon. Mao says, when we engage in study, the same holds good for the contradiction in the passage from ignorance to knowledge. At the very beginning of our study of Marxism, our ignorance of scanty acquaintance with Marxism stands in contradiction to knowledge of Marxism. But by a ignorance can be transformed into knowledge, scanty knowledge into substantial knowledge, and blindness in the application of Marxism into mastery of its application. So let's leave off with that there. Now we're going to move into the next section, which is identity and struggle of the aspects of contradiction. So the meaning of identity, I'm going to quote Mao again directly so that he can best share what this means. Identity, unity, coincidence, interpenetration, interpermeation, interdependence or mutual dependence for existence, interconnection or mutual cooperation. All these different terms mean the same thing and refer to the following 2 points. First, the existence of each of the 2 aspects of a contradiction in the process of the development of a thing presupposes the existence of the other aspect, and both aspects coexist in a single entity. Second, in given conditions, each of the 2 contradictory aspects transforms itself into its opposite. This is the meaning of identity. So opposites exclude and rely on each other. So every process has this characteristic, the difference being that a simple process will have fewer opposites and a more complex one will have more, even countless at times, ones we can't even see. So opposites exist on their own and in juxtaposition to their counterpoints. And I'm going to once again quote Mao because he says it the best. And this is something that Mao does very well, is very succinctly stating what might be a complex concept. And this, he says here, without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. Without below, there would be no above. Without misfortune, there would be no good fortune. Without good fortune, there would be no misfortune. Without facility, there would be no difficulty. Without difficulty, there would be no facility. Without landlords, there would be no tenant peasants. Without tenant peasants, there would be no landlords. Without the bourgeoisie, there would be no proletariat. Without the proletariat, there would be no bourgeoisie. Without imperialist oppression of nations, there would be no colonies or semi-colonies. Without colonies or semi-colonies, there would be no imperialist oppression of nations. So again, this is going back to the point earlier. It all connects with Lenin of how you can't have a positive if you don't have a negative. It can't be characterized by anything other than having this relation to its opposite. So even though opposites negate each other, they also require each other to exist, which is the point that we've kind of been going back to and stressing. There's also another brief quote here. In given conditions, each of the contradictory aspects within a thing transforms itself into its opposite, changes its position to that of its opposite. This is the second meaning of the identity of contradiction. So, in revolution, the ruling becomes the ruled. The ruled becomes the ruling. There's a reversal of roles. This is very important. Mao goes on to say, all contradictory things are interconnected. Not only do they coexist in a single entity in given conditions, but in other given conditions, they also transform themselves into each other. This is the full meaning of the identity of opposites. So understanding this reversal of opposites is essential for Marxists, as this is why we wage struggle and we seek revolution, is to have this reversal of roles, so that for the first time the majority, the proletariat, has its hand on the state and can facilitate these changes that we need. So the thing is, identity requires certain conditions, and so there's two that I want to reference. Actually, I'll reference the second one. I already mentioned the egg. The first one's the egg. But this one says, when we said above that two opposite things can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other because there is identity between them, we were speaking of conditionality. That is to say, in given conditions, two contradictory things can be united and can transform themselves into each other. But in the absence of these conditions, they cannot constitute a contradiction, cannot coexist in the same entity, and cannot transform themselves into one another. So we'll close off there. And so finally, we have a very important concept. This is the idea of antagonisms, contradictions. So basically,
That's the
struggle of
word. I've been
contradictions
thinking
can be
about this whole time. I was trying to remember the word. The word was
antagonist.
antagonism. Yeah, I was like, Jesus Christ.
Oh my God!
Thank you.
I mean, like it's oh my God. Yeah, this is actually a pretty important idea because it constitutes strategy as well for organizing. But anyways, so struggle of contradictions, this fighting between the two aspects, can be both antagonistic and non-antagonistic. And so, in a process, you can see there's a flipping between the two, and this depends on the immediate conditions. So obviously the best example we have is class struggle, because we see it every day.
Yeah.
Well, actually, in everyday life, you think about it, class struggle, it's not antagonistic inherently. There's no open warfare or violence per se. And this is something that, the liberalism and the capitalist state ensure. They try to keep it this way, where there's no like physical conflict. But inevitably, you have crisis that leads to angst, violence, and potential revolution
It
breaking
will
out.
turn into an
And revolution,
antagonistic one.
yes, it turns antagonistic. Thank you. And revolution itself is the manifestation of the contradictions of class struggle simply becoming antagonistic, where before they were non-antagonistic. And so understanding this progression from non-antagonistic to antagonistic is really important because, it shows us that because despite the immediate conditions, under liberalism, the class struggle is non-antagonistic, it seems impossible to break from. But the inevitability is that there's going to be periods of antagonism by the very nature of class struggle. So, revolutions, they bring change because only antagonistic struggle can really create the conditions through which these contradictions are transformed. And the thing is, Mao also stresses this, the strategy can't be applied dogmatically nor mechanically. So, again, I'm going to quote Mao because, damn it, he says it best. However, we must make a concrete study of the circumstances of each specific struggle of opposites and should not arbitrarily apply the formula discussed above to everything. Contradiction and struggle are universal and absolute, but the methods of resolving contradictions, that is, the forms of struggle, differ according to the differences in the nature of contradictions. Some contradictions are characterized by open antagonism, others are not. In accordance with the concrete development of things, some contradictions, which were originally non-antagonistic, develop into antagonistic ones, while others, which were originally antagonistic, develop into non-antagonistic ones. And so this idea of antagonistic to non-antagonistic, or in reverse, it also applies, as I mentioned earlier with previous points that I brought up, it also applies not just within the masses and society in general, but within the party. And so a really good example we have here is this example of the Bolsheviks, where you had these two camps of Lenin and Stalin against Bukharin and Trotsky. And, it technically begins non-antagonistically. It's sort of an ideological disagreement. But over time, if not dealt with, it devolves into attempts at sabotage and necessary violence to mitigate them. So it does break out into sort of open conflict. And this is probably one of the best examples we have because we saw it happen in this case study, essentially. And so here we have a contribution from Mao on how we avoid antagonistic developments within the party. Self-criticism and criticism is a very important idea. You have to essentially bring these issues to the open, because openness of disagreement allows for all parties to partake, and it allows for a more principled dealing with these issues. Because if you don't have openness, you end up having secret factionalism, which is essentially what we see with Bukharin. And there's actually a really good article that I am going to recommend, and I'll type it in the chat later. It's from Stalin. It's called Bukharin's Group and the Right Deviations in Our Party. It's a letter, or it's a speech or letter from Stalin to the party regarding this secret factionalism from Bukharin and the
Yes.
right
Also, to
deviation.
give it some historical outline, is the factionalism from Bukharin and Trotsky is what led to the purges, to what is known as the Great Purges.
Right.
So, just so you know, people have a historical knowledge of it, of why it happened.
That's right. Yes, it's good. Yes, to give that context as well. So this is why we see a lot of this disagreement within the party. This obviously we know the propaganda here is that Stalin just killed people in the party because bloodthirsty or whatever. But it goes back to it goes to show that the contradictions are very important, and if you don't deal with them, you are going to end up in a place where you have to use violence because they become antagonistic, right? An antagonistic contradiction can't be dealt with in a pacifist manner or in a civil manner, you might say. You can absolutely deal with them when they're in their non-antagonistic forms, but if you don't, you approach
before it becomes antagonistic.
Exactly. You have to your tactic, like Mao says, your tactic has to change accordingly. And so in an antagonistic period of time when the contradiction is openly antagonistic, you have to meet it with the proper response. But anyways, and I'm just going to read the conclusion from this. I think it's a good way to sum everything up. And here we go. We may now say a few words to sum up. The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the fundamental law of nature and of society, and therefore also the fundamental law of thought. It stands opposed to the metaphysical world outlook. It represents a great revolution in the history of human knowledge. According to dialectical materialism, contradiction is present in all processes of objectively existing things and of subjective thought, and permeates all these processes from beginning to end. This is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. Each contradiction and each of its aspects have their respective characteristics. This is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. In given conditions, opposites possess identity and consequently can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other. This again is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. But the struggle of opposites is ceaseless. It goes on both when the opposites are coexisting and when they are transforming themselves into each other, and become especially conspicuous when they are transforming themselves into one another. This again is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. In studying the particularity and relativity of contradiction, we must give attention to the distinction between the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradictions, and to the distinction between the principal aspect and the non-principal aspect of a contradiction. In studying the universality of contradiction and the struggle of opposites in contradiction, we must give attention to the distinction between the different forms of struggle. Otherwise, we shall make mistakes. If, through study, we achieve a real understanding of the essentials explained above, we shall be able to demolish dogmatist ideas which are contrary to the basic principles of Marxism-Leninism and detrimental to our revolutionary cause, and our comrades with practical experience will be able to organize their experience into principles and avoid repeating empiricist errors. These are a few simple conclusions from our study of the law of contradiction. And Mao closes off there, and that is also where I close off. So...
All right, so I just shared on contradiction into Marxist.org. So if anybody wants to read it themselves, they can. If they don't have a physical copy.
Actually, you know what? I'm gonna quickly see if I can find this. Just want to get the Stalin article. I think it's a good read. I mean,
everybody's applauding you, Kooks.
Thank you. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned something. I hope I wasn't just rambling. Okay.
No, it is definitely a good in-depth explanation, because it could definitely be a tough topic to, get onto. On contradiction is not something you could read once.
Yeah.
Names.
You're gonna have to read.
I like it. Yeah.
Several times with other texts to pair it along with, And what was the text that you were talking about earlier that you should also read with on contradiction?
The
It was
Stalin
with
one?
Stalin, yeah.
Oh no, yeah, this is I just posted it in the chat.
Okay.
That's that. It's not technically, it's not theory. It's not theory, but to me, I don't know. It's
It
eye
pairs
opening. It
well.
also kind of shows you what's up.
You said it pairs well, right?
Yeah, yeah. In that context of like party conflict and stuff. So if you want to see like how contradictions when they're not dealt with, what you end up having is this secret factionalism. If you don't have a way to deal with it, of the earlier contradictions when they're non-antagonistic, if you don't have a way of dealing with them, they're gonna break out into more antagonistic forms, and this is what you have.
Yeah, that's
So
definitely
yeah,
one of the earlier problems of early struggles of the socialist revolution when the Soviet
absolutely.
Union didn't really deal with the contradictions within the party with a different factionalism. And of course,
Mhm.
you can't just outright say, "Oh, how dare they not fix it? How dare they not do it?" Like, well, you can definitely fault them for it. You can definitely say, "Oh, yeah, they should have definitely taken a stronger stance on fighting this contradiction within the party." At the same time, this is the
Right.
first time it's ever happened. This is the Soviet Union.
That's
It's the
true.
first time a socialist
Exactly.
country state has ever existed. So it's kind of a give and
Right.
take.
Yes. That's the other thing is like,
Hmm.
when you really take the scientific part to heart, you also realize that this was an experiment,
Hmm.
right? And we got to learn from it. I
Yeah.
mean, this is kind of, when he says we avoid repeating um, empiricist errors. I mean, this stuff is written down for us to avoid repeating these mistakes. And so, it is a big issue, obviously. The rise of sort of factions in party organizing. It's not unheard of. It's actually very common. So, knowing how to deal with it and knowing how to liquidate it, that's extremely essential. And so this knowing how to deal with contradictions, and this is why I like this text a lot. It kind of gives this general idea of contradictions, a very kind of specific character to where you can be like, oh, so they can be antagonistic or non-antagonistic, and knowing how to deal with them accordingly. I think it's really good. Actually, I'm reading the chat right now. That's a really good comment, Keish. I agree. I actually read On Contradiction and Dialectical and Historical Materialism back to back in preparation for this, just to compare them. Um, they go. I'd say they go very well together. Obviously, I would say in historical order because you can see also the progression of ideas. So
Yeah, also, I just wanted
yes.
to go on of how external causes was, well, the factionalism and the fact that uh, the revisionist portion of the Soviet Union took over in the Soviet Union with Khrushchev's clique. It's what
Mhm.
led to in China with having the Cultural Revolution. So even
Right.
though this,
Oh, yeah.
wasn't, even though yes, sure, you can definitely say there was a factionalism and a burgeoning bourgeois within inside the party. It was what happened in the Soviet
Right.
Union. It's what led to China going on with the Cultural Revolution. So yes, so it's
Yeah.
not just
Right.
internal. So the internal was there was a bourgeois element in the party, but the external was saying what would happen if it let it festers.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and, it's overall, if you haven't read it, definitely read it.
Mhm.
It's good. Highly recommend. It goes into a good amount of detail.
Yeah.
I mean, again, Mao. It's obviously it's philosophical. It's not really theory in the sense that it sort of talks about necessarily capitalism first and foremost. It obviously uses it as examples, but it's more of like a way of changing how we analyze the world. So it's
Mhm.
highly philosophical. But again,
It's a good read.
Mao, Mao, Mao writes it pretty simply. I'll tell you that. He writes
Yeah.
it as simply, I think, as someone can when you're talking about such a
With Sushi Touch, it's a big
complicated
concept. Yeah.
concept. Yeah, I mean it's huge. I mean, and the more you think about it, the more you apply it to examples you can see on a daily basis, it makes it easier to understand. That's something that I find. The more you kind of try to apply it, the better you get at it. And so I think applying and sort of checking to see, oh, does this make sense? And obviously, this is where talking to others is really important. You ask them, or you discuss these things like, do we think this? Do we think that? And so, obviously, communication is a huge part of learning, especially in this case because we're all at different stages. I mean, you mentioned that Kachel was in the chat earlier.
Yeah.
let me just say that's like my source of learning right now for the most part. So it's great. You're always looking to learn more, and I think
Yeah.
this only helps you further your own sort of personal method of learning. And
Yeah.
so yeah,
And
that paired with on practice,
it's
obviously.
pretty easy to say because I mean we're not currently engaging in revolution, so why not
Right.
pick up on contradiction? Why not
Right. It
pick
helps
up on
you.
something? Yeah.
Yeah. It helps you sort of fine
Hmm.
tune your actual
Yeah.
critiques, and it also helps you fine tune how you relay those critiques to others. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, there's a lot of spooky words. I mean, you don't want to go up to
No.
someone when you're and just throw proletariat at them necessarily. Um,
You're like,
I mean,
so let's
bourgeoisie,
talk
obviously.
about contradictions
Yeah,
and
yeah. It
the
helps you. It helps you
external, internal.
engage. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't actually like. This is not a way of organizing. This is just a way of like understanding how organizing changes. For example, given different conditions. I think it really shows you how organizing isn't just we organize marches and protests and stuff because the conditions change. There are going to be periods of time where that's not viable, or there are periods of time when that should accompany other things, and it's not like you have to understand how the tactics fit with each other as well. And so understanding the different phase you're in of whether or not a contradiction is currently antagonistic or non-antagonistic. This is actually something Bolsheviks were good at, was knowing when to retreat or advance the party, you know? And so like there were periods of time where the Tsar was kind of lenient. He eased up and he was like more of a reformist phase. And so they knew that they could push forward with legal organization more than illegal organization, for example. But then when they get more cracking down on people and they use more police force, then you say, all right, we're going to scale back our legal organization and kind of up our illegal. But you can't eliminate one for the other, obviously, because
And
again,
also,
those
this
two are
is
also
where a big part where the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks kind of really started clashing because
yes,
the
right.
Mensheviks really wanted to stay on the legal route. They really wanted to
Hmm.
do hey, we're gonna vote in socialism. We're gonna do this through all the legal routes. Even though you could really say socialism is more social democracy, which you know
Hang on.
you can say like democratic socialism is what all really gonna lead to. Um, but yeah, that was like a really big portion of hey, the bourgeois is trying to quell, or kind of, I want to say quell or soften this heightened sense of contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat. I already forgot the word. It's an A word. Fuck.
Antagonistic,
Antagonistic. Geez, I
bro.
forget
It's
that word
in
all the
State
time.
and Revolution. The
Sue me.
irreconcilable
Anyway,
antagonism. Write this down.
I'm gonna have to tattoo antagonism right into my arm, so every time I forget it.
Oh man.
Uh, no, since the Tsar wanted to soften this antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeois, they started putting out quiet reforms, which
Hmm.
Bolsheviks gave into. Bolsheviks like, all right,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
if we can do it
Yeah.
this way, then yeah.
Yeah. A lot of it was like they wouldn't also leave the war, right? The
Caboose,
reforms
god
were just
damn
kind
it.
of like
What the hell,
you're like
Caboose?
what?
This
Oh, Caboose is being weird again.
Caboose does this
I actually
thing where
saw.
he
Hold on. I
types.
think I
It's
saw
terrible.
a comment earlier. I think it's good to address. The Iced Morte says no. Idealism is based on ideas changing the world. Materialism, the world changing ideas. Dialectism is a type of metaphysics that wants to bring it there. Um, I mean, here's the thing. Both. I mean, there is a mechanical materialistic outlook on life, very vulgar, the metaphysical outlook. So they both can devolve to metaphysics, but that's why you have the dialectical outlook, because you have materialism versus idealism, then you have metaphysics versus dialectics. And so you can have, I don't want to say mix, but you can have like a sort of, and this is what I mentioned very early on, is how you can have a sort of vulgar materialist outlook, which is the metaphysical outlook, right? uh, it's still materialist in that the world is changing, the material conditions are the primary force change of ideas, um, but that's why you have the dialectical outlook. It's to contrast that, to see things as more interconnected. So you can have a metaphysical outlook through each idealist or materialist lens. You absolutely can, but and I wouldn't say they're inherently metaphysical. They both have the metaphysical aspect or the dialectical aspect. But yeah, so the
Too
dialectics.
many big words, Blot. Just think of it as a thing exists because its opposite exists, and they fight depending on whether or not it's actually an antagonistic thing. There you go.
Yeah, yeah. So dialectics, metaphysical, and Hegel. I don't know. I was under the impression it was mostly just like the idealist angle was kind of the main focus of like the German idealists. I don't know. I mean, like perhaps it was metaphysical, but I don't think it was like necessarily the main focus. I would say. But yeah, like the metaphysical outlook is, again, it's very things as individual units and not in connection. Both. Yes. Yes. That's a good way of putting it, Swan. Yeah, you understand and oppose both idealism and metaphysics. I wouldn't put them on like the same plane of like sort of ideological hold. Like you can have a metaphysical materialist outlook, which is the vulgar one that we should avoid. But you can also have the dialectical. So you want to focus on the materialist angle, not the idealist angle, obviously. But again, in the nature of all dialectical relationships, ideas do have influence on material conditions, but they are not the primary force in this case. The material world would be the sort of principal aspect at play here. But yeah. All right. So, I mean, if there's other questions, we can wait in the chat a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, Duck explained it right. You can have metaphysical materialism or metaphysical idealism, and you can have a dialectical one of each as well.
Yeah.
They're describing different things. Materialism is juxtaposed to idealism, and metaphysical is juxtaposed to dialectics. Yeah. All right. That is all. I mean,
so look, Kooks, you did too good of a job explaining that. There are no questions.
there's no way. There's no way.
Mask up,
Poseidon
Karens.
bot.
Oh my god, that's so funny. Okay, so we can raid out to Feminist Critique. Hold on, I'm going to share the screen so you can... We're going to do the outro.
You have no clear questions in your brain, Tsunami?
Just processing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you know my my handle on Twitter, assuming you have a Twitter, you just
It's in the
need DM
intro and the
questions.
outro.
It's
Hold
shawarma
on.
Maoist.
Oh
Shawarma
shit,
Maoist.
it
That's one
fucking
word
changed. I gotta change everything.
here. Yeah,
now.
here, hold on.
Damn it.
I'll just write it here. I thought it was funny, all right? I thought it was funny. Here we go. That's the one. Shawarma
Okay.
Maoist.
Oh my god, guys, Kooks is in the chat.
Oh my god. I have to be. I
Okay.
have to type my handle.
So
Yeah.
tomorrow we will be in the Discord doing the watching for Revolutionary Kicks. So I will see you in
We're
the
watching
Discord
a
tomorrow.
ballet, right?
Ooh, that would be
Is
cute.
that what it is?
Probably.
Uh,
I don't know.
Hayes says a lot of words. He says he's gonna do this, this, and this, and I'm just like, all right.
Okay.
Oh, since it is gonna
Oh.
be the Discord, let me just put the Discord in the chat really quick. So
Okay.
keep the connection.
Shameless plug. Shameless plug, by the way. This is fire. Recommend getting it. Keeping it by your bedside like a small pocket Bible.
Pocket
Yeah.
Bible.
That's what I do with
Someone's
my
annoying you at
copy
work.
of Little
Someone's
Red
annoying you at
Book.
work. Just go. Hang on a second. Page 133. I don't know.
Thank you everyone for following. We are going over to Feminist Critique. We'll see you tomorrow.
Maybe.